Hello, and welcome to this episode of Such a Nightmare, Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and I'm so excited to get to talk to, once again, Toni Tresca.
Hey there.
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And today we are so excited to have you join us for our conversation about 1995's Leprechaun 3, also known as Leprechaun 3 in Vegas.
So we have watched Leprechaun 1 and Leprechaun 2, and we are now in the midst of this third one. I'm going to tell you there's not really, unsurprisingly, there's not really any scholarship that I could find on Leprechaun 3. And the ways I tried to go into it, I tried to look for some stuff on Las Vegas and horror, but it kept coming up with fear and loathing in Las Vegas. And so I gave up on that. And then I tried to find some stuff on greed and horror, and it kept taking me to communist websites that I didn't necessarily feel like going down that path at this time. So
Fair
while
enough.
there's one of them kept trying to load, and I was like, you know what, I'm going to take this loading moment as a sign that I should just not be clicking on the site. So there's not much scholarship, but we can offer a plot summary. So Toni, for folks who have not watched this film or have not watched it recently, what is Leprechaun 3 Vegas style all about?
So we begin with a disgruntled man who's missing some limbs, who needs to sell desperately this statue of a leprechaun to an Indian shop owner who which the film will make some racist remarks about very quickly. Don't you worry, it is the 90s. And so he's got to sell this statue here, and tells him don't remove this medallion around the necklace, which naturally, as soon as the guy leaves, the shop owner removes the medallion, a pot of gold appears, and Leprechaun is loose in Vegas. And not just any leprechaun, our good old friend Lubdan, it's the same leprechaun who we've followed now for the past 2 installments. Although, canon be damned, it doesn't really matter. I don't really think no events from the previous 2 films factor in any significant way to this film. And it's because it's an entirely new plot, because quickly we and cast of characters, because kind of quickly we realize that after Lubdan kills the shop owner with some racism and violence as well, he realizes a coin is missing, which kind of sets us off on this whole quest. Scott McCoy is a college student who's passing through Vegas, who is helping a motorcyclist get a job at the Shamrock Casino, and they kind of then go through all of these shenanigans inside the casino. That's kind of the framing device to get you inside the door. And then from here, honestly, this is some of the most unadulterated leprechaun shenanigans from here. Characters are turning into leprechauns. There's so much magic. There's an actual magician in this one. There's magic coins that you can wish on in here. And again, I should say, no logic, magic-wise, or plot points from the previous films really carry over. It's entirely new leprechaun logic.
Yes.
And that makes sense to me, because the writer of this film, David Dubois, was given the opportunity to pitch Leprechaun 3 without having seen Leprechaun 1 or 2, and being given no information about the franchise other than write a spec script for Leprechaun in Las Vegas. And that he did.
We've talked about the fact that there's a lot of films right now that are being released that are continuing IP, and how frustrating it is, because it's like they didn't watch the first couple of films in the franchise. And often I find that very frustrating, because I'm like, why didn't you just make another film and just call it by a different name, right? Why? Mm-hmm. There is something rather delightful, though, in the Leprechaun franchise about this idea that we're going to continue making films where there's just not going to be any attempt or actual knowledge of the past history of the franchise, that I actually rather appreciate. So I kind of hope it continues, because it works in this franchise in a way that it doesn't in almost any of the other franchises we've looked at.
Totally. And I think it's because there is a lot to be mined out of the central conceit of Leprechaun in fill in the blank, which
Yes.
I'm honestly shocked to say that sentence out loud. But after on my third iteration of these, they really do keep finding ways to reinvent the Leprechaun wheel.
They do. Because this is the first one where we have magic, really, with like
Totally.
wishes and stuff, despite the fact that that, of course, makes total sense. I mean, the only real thing that stayed the same is Warwick Davis as our
Hmm.
leprechaun and then his obsession with gold, right? But like everything
Right.
else about it, it's like, oh, yeah, I guess we could explore what would happen. And then they do. And it's different.
Yeah, where I think the first Leprechaun film really weirdly plays it a little bit straight. It's like
Mm-hmm.
Leprechaun in suburbia, and that's fine enough. As you can go back and listen to our full thoughts on the episode, but TLDR, what didn't really work for either of us. The second one is kind of more fantasy like land,
Yes.
but grounded fantasy, like high, like not your magic fantasy, more of your ground, like your earthy fantasy kind of things. We go back, it gets very legendary and how in the storytelling, then we jump to present day and it's a lot more silly. I really enjoyed that one. And then this
Mm-hmm.
one is definitely like you said, we're in Magic Land and it's Vegas, which is ultimate ground for greed.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was interesting though that I'm not sure that I felt that our characters in this one, I thought they were actually some of the greedy list folks out of our film so far, because it felt like I'm not sure you can get too much greedier than in the second film with, is it Marty? Is that his name? The guy who runs the company that ends up having all of the gold inside his tummy and then it gets ripped out.
Yeah, the cab driver, his uncle.
Yeah, yes, yeah. So I'm not sure you can get too much more greedy than him, at least in terms of how the greed bites him. But I thought it was interesting. I guess I expected more of Vegas, and I know that they weren't actually in Vegas for the vast majority of the film in terms of filming, but like I thought there was more opportunity for us to see the idea that it's not just people with leprechaun gold that's greedy, right? It's like capitalism, it's America, it is Vegas. And
Sure.
I thought there'd be some more of that. I think that was a missed opportunity in a film that otherwise was fun, right? I'm not sure it was profound, but it was certainly fun.
Yeah, I this is not as for me it was not as slick as Leprechaun 2 and it was and not as funny either. I totally agree with
No, it
you on
really
that.
wasn't.
You do feel that the budget has been chopped down, that they filmed this whole thing in 14 days. And so they're really, which is honestly impressive. Is in
Especially
it
when you consider how much time alone, right, it took to get them into makeup.
totally.
That's a lot of it's a very small number of days. And I think I remember reading, because I watched this film on Amazon Prime and you know it has the like trivia thing, and it said that they were only filming like 12-hour days. So 14 days to get through everything they did was really impressive, considering they weren't like putting in 22-hour days. But you can feel it, right? Because wasn't that part of the deal, is that like it wasn't just can you write us a script for Leprechaun in Vegas, but like can you create the most cost effective film possible?
Correct. His pitch won out against six other writers, largely due to the fact that it could start immediately, pretty much. Uh so the film, like you mentioned, I'd actually only shot one day in Vegas. The rest of the film was shot in LA.
Yeah. At a hotel that's no longer in existence. I thought that was interesting. So other than having a scene on the strip, right? You definitely don't have to film in a Vegas casino, because the whole point of Vegas casinos is that they feel placeless and you don't remember that there's an outside world that you can escape to. But I think I wanted a little bit more of that, right? Like I really wanted it to kind of lean into the hedonism of Vegas, so that and this isn't going to happen. I realize this in a film that is largely affirmative, but to have there sort of be like, is actually the leprechaun the most dangerous thing about Vegas? I kind of it would have been interesting to see it play with that theme a little bit more, with the answer being no, right? That like at the end of the day, a leprechaun is not nearly as scary as a city that builds on this idea that you're going to lose your livelihood. But we get hints of that, right? So our main guy, what is his name again? The one who turns vaguely leprechaun-y?
Yeah, so the guy who turns vaguely leprechaun-y is Scott McCoy.
That's right. So Scott, I mean, we see him gamble, right? We see him get kind of addicted
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning because he has that like note from his dad and mom that's like, use this money for your tuition. And then he loses it. But I guess I just wanted a little bit more of the grittiness, which is an unfair ask, to be perfectly honest, of a Leprechaun film. But there were moments. But some of my favorite moments, some of the moments I thought were the funniest, actually were throwaway moments. The scene I thought was the funniest was the conversation the two security guards are having, where they're talking about their underwear and socks, and he's like,
Oh,
"Yeah,
right.
that's why I wear this type of socks," and he's like, "Yeah, that's a good point." Like, I think I wanted a little bit more of that, because I didn't even think that Warwick Davis got to be as funny in this film as he was in the second one. I think in the second one and in the first one, right, he really got to like lean into his comedy, and maybe it's the fact that he had to speak in rhymes the whole time.
That was a new choice this time around. I was like,
It
and you
was.
notice it right away, is that
Yes.
all of his little zingers are rhymed this time around, which is
Yes. Yes.
fun at times, grating
Sure.
at
Sure.
others.
Yes. And I think it just meant that we didn't get to see him be as funny as he had been in some of the other ones.
Which is interesting because in an interview with IGN, Davis actually says that this is his favorite film because, and I quote, "I like the humor in it. I think it
I
tapped
know.
into the potential of bringing a comedic element to it all. And Brian Trenchard Smith, who directed that one, is an incredible director. He manages to get so much out of so little money, and that was what was great working about him. He really got the humor."
So that was one of the little trivia pieces that Amazon Prime had. And I read the trivia before I watched the film, because I don't
Ah,
like, yeah, I don't like doing it during the, like, as the film progresses. And sometimes I forget to do it at the end. And so I was like, oh, good. If he thinks that this is the funniest of the bunch, I'm really excited to see what's happening. But it just, even the kills weren't as funny as they had been in some of the other ones.
totally.
The slot machine, when he turned that one person to a slot machine, that was funny-ish, right? But like, I don't know, they were much more clever, I thought, in the second one.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, it is more absurd, perhaps in some cases. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think because of the reverses, I think there is some really good fun that's had with the reversal of wishes. That is like that an element we mentioned up at the top. Two characters, the magician wishes to be the world's greatest magician, and then this other character, her name is Loretta, who's played
Oh
by
yeah.
Caroline Williams, who has been in several other films, horror films, including Stretch in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre film series, which I didn't
Oh
realize until afterwards.
yeah.
But so her character wishes to be more beautiful or something. It's more specific than that. She wishes to be
Right.
sexy, and then
And then it turns
obviously
against
both of
her.
those, yeah, both of those
Yeah,
cases get flipped on them. Her that one, Loretta is quite grotesque as she
it is.
expands in full practical effect glory on screen in front of you. The butt, the breast, the lips in particular, I think were the most freaky to me. So I thought that one was pretty interesting too. That was pretty interesting kill. Although the magician one was a little bit more simplistic, where the leprechaun switches. Oh, he's the lead magician, and the magician gets in the box, and so he saws the magician in half, and it's pretty gory. I mean, particularly when he
Mm-hmm.
opens up the box and you see like all of the intestines like fall through. So it's very. I mean, I remembered it very clearly right then, but it's perhaps not as, like you said, inventive all the way around as number two.
But I agree. I did think that Loretta's death was haunting,
Yeah.
because, she, especially, so there was something kind of interesting that was happening in this one for me, and that
Uh
is
huh.
that there was, in some of the other ones, it feels like the only people who die are people who, quote, deserve to die. But in this one, like, I'm not sure that Loretta deserved to die, in the same way that, like, in number two, that guy who was like, "Oh, but I'm a nice guy. Why don't you want to be with me?" was, murdered. And so it was interesting, because this film had a sort of different take on who got to be victims,
Mm,
and how we're supposed to feel with them. And many of them were ones that I didn't feel bad when they died, like the sleazy casino owner. But
sure.
I think part of what was disturbing about Loretta's is that, like, it didn't seem, in comparison to what everyone else was asking for, her ask just seemed I don't know. It didn't seem as big of a deal. Also, she didn't have the coin. It was an interesting decision to kind of put that in there.
Yeah, because I guess that kind of goes through. There's this plot line in there in which Tammy, who is vaguely with Scott in the movie, is working for Fazio, who is the magician character, as his young, kind of sexy assistant. And it's kind of implied that maybe Loretta was formerly doing that position,
Mm-hmm.
or she has always wanted to be doing that position, but he tells her straight up she's just not. She needs to lose weight. Actually, that is
Yeah, he's like,
not mince
if you
words.
were 20 pounds lighter, and I was like, wow, that's real intense.
And so it's interesting. Yeah, she uses her wish to kind of get that job slash get this different body, and then she is punished in the same way, if in a honestly very, again, like I said, very
Yeah.
gruesome fashion, the most, I think, grotesque of the whole film. So it's definitely an interesting choice.
And it's one that has a rich sort of foundation in horror, because there's oftentimes a source of horror is not just the grotesque, but the female body as grotesque, right? And that is often connected with what is grotesque about a woman's body. Well, what if it was excessively large, right? What if it was excessively exaggerated? So, in that respect, they're leaning into a pretty ripe playing field in terms of, this is an easy thing to add into a film, to have there be something that's disturbing because it's a woman's body that's not beautiful. But it just, I don't know, it was an interesting decision because it was probably the darkest, in many ways, of the kills, if not the most violent. I also thought it was interesting to see, as he was kind of just like murdering his way through folks. I just always find it interesting which deaths they decide to really like make extravagant and which ones they don't. Like, he kills the security guards with I think a golf club, and there's really no blood. There's very minimal anything, right? But then like Fazio, it's blood everywhere. So again, you can kind of see where they were trying to skimp on their budget, and where they were trying to save it for the practical effects that were going to be the big ones.
Yeah, like another pretty good effective practical effect is Mitch's death, when like this he thinks this after he tries to lure Tammy into his room yet
Mm-hmm.
again, which is I guess another new, like, there is that element of sexual debauchery in this one
Yes.
that is present explicitly, which I guess is gesturing to the terrible nature and underbelly of Las Vegas, and maybe how the real evil people are are the people in charge, like Mitch. So she rejects his advances, and then he fires her. And so then Lubden kind of tricks Mitch into watching a woman who looks very similar to her undress on the television set, crawls out of the television, but then it's a robot that electrocutes him, which
Yes.
was also pretty well done. I thought that whole sequence.
It was. Yeah, it really was. And there's actually a line that Tammy makes that in like true 90s horror fashion is a throwaway line that was like, wow, there's a lot of trauma packed into that really small sentence, where she says to Scott something like, this isn't the first time it's happened. This is just the first time I've gotten fired. And then the film just kind of moves on, and I'm like, wow, that's a really casual but unsurprising for a 90s horror film approach to, like you said, not just the debauchery, but the just like sexual harassment that this woman has
Yeah.
experienced and experiences repeatedly throughout the film, right? She's definitely treated like property by the magician as well, and it's just kind of, and I guess that's the thing that Scott offers, right? Is that he's got that boyish charm where he thinks she's gosh darn pretty, but isn't like creepy and sexual, except for when he's a leprechaun.
Yeah, I was about to say, and that's another interesting element of transformation that occurs in this film. That is, again, you said this at the top of the podcast, but I think it's true. It is. I think it's unexpectedly great that they didn't watch any of the others, because we get this moment, like this insane transformation of Scotty, like subtly turning into an Irish leprechaun throughout the film, so that he can go battle against
Yes.
Lubden.
Yes. And he gets magic too, right? Like, I mean, they just kind
Yes.
of again created this very different origin and like back story for our leprechauns than we've seen before. Because in the other ones, right? Like in 2, he talks about the fact that like the reason he needs a bride is so that he can have, leprechaun babies. There's no like, oh, or I could just pour my blood on someone, right? That's just like, that's so totally new to this film in a way that just works because, I mean, I guess we could say because, like what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in this version of Leprechaun doesn't have to happen in any of the other Leprechaun films.
Totally.
And that works, I guess. I will say one of the things I did like, again, it wasn't Davis that I got most of my humor from. It was these other little random moments. So there was one moment when they were in the hospital, because that's where Scotty ends up, right? Because he's turning into a leprechaun, where we see that there's a slot machine in the lobby of the hospital. And I did particularly enjoy just that tiny moment because that, I mean, there are slot machines in the Vegas airports. There are slot machines everywhere in Vegas. And that was a funny sort of little moment. But so much of this film played, I thought, much more seriously than some of the other ones that we have seen so far.
Yeah.
Did you see some of the other ideas that they had for this film? Because one of the little trivia pieces was that there was a version of this film that was going to be a court case. Did you see that?
Say more. I didn't see this.
So there was, and I got a little confused in the reading of this trivia. It was the longest of the trivias, but there was going to be, originally there was talk about number 3 being pretty much happening directly after number 2, where the main guy was on trial for the murders of the people that had been murdered in 2, because there was some, they were suspicious of him even in the film. And then Bridget had to like try to defend him, but then somebody got possessed by the spirit of the leprechaun. The way it read was that the entire film was going to be more or less a courtroom drama. And I have so many questions about that, because there were still murders, like deaths were still happening, but I don't know if the whole thing was going to happen like on a single set. Was it all going to happen in the courtroom, or were there moments out? It also didn't say why that one got discounted. I mean, other than the fact it's not a very good idea. But I thought that was interesting that there had been talk about us as seeing the consequences of number 2, and very explicitly like in the courtroom. And it was going to be like that the sheriff was the father of the guy that had gotten killed, and so he was on a vendetta. I don't know. It would have been a wildly different film is my point. So I think they made a right decision, actually, by taking us to Vegas.
That does sound more interesting than like a courtroom drama where we unpack the implications of the previous film. That's insane. I can see maybe that's like one of the pitches that they were like, you can definitely start shooting that immediately anywhere. You can.
Yeah.
So maybe it was just like, what can we do for cheap? Write us that. Let's see if we'll just pick whatever works the best. That's probably exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, clearly it is, right? Like they were like, hey, you don't even need to take time to do research on 1 and 2, right? You don't have to spend what would have been no more than 3 hours watching the first 2 films.
They're not even long films.
Yeah, no, and it's not like they're hard films to unpack, right? But they were like, don't even waste your time with that 3 hours. That's how fast we need a script done.
I love that. These are the people making them. They're like, don't waste your time with that garbage. The films we made.
I actually kind of, not always, but there's something delightful about that being the Leprechaun franchise's story. Especially because we talked a lot about this with Friday the 13th, right? That like how many of them felt they had seen the other films and they felt like they were creating an award-winning masterpiece. And so like with that franchise, it very much, they felt weighted down oftentimes, right? By the burden of these other directors, these other filmmakers. Of course, Nightmare on Elm Street's Craven kind of the whole way through. So he's getting to do whatever he wants within his world. But there's something kind of nice about this idea that's like, don't even bother. Just see what comes up. The only stipulation is you can't spend any money and there will be a leprechaun. And I guess that's what we got.
Yeah. It was, at the time, it was the highest selling independent direct-to-video film of the year, selling a whopping 55,000 units, which, I don't know, I guess that's good.
I guess so.
Yeah, they don't provide what that translates to in dollars, but it only had a budget of $1.2 million. So I wouldn't honestly be surprised if they made back their money here with this one.
I mean, they would have had to, I feel like. And I don't know enough to know if like 50, I mean, obviously it was the highest grossing. So 55,000 is clearly a lot, but like I don't have any framework for that other than just that tidbit that it's a lot. And like direct to video, I guess there would have been marketing still, right? Because they would have needed to like get it out there that they've made this film.
Yeah,
But
I think so. Some level of marketing, perhaps just
and
on
then
like
I'm sure it
TV or
like
something.
right, and then I'm sure it would have been in the movie stores and stuff available to rent
Right.
because that's something we have to keep in mind that that doesn't mean that's how many people watched it, right? That's how many, I guess, VHS tapes, DVDs.
No, you're right. VHS tapes, because
Yeah.
they actually made clear that it wasn't until 2001 that they released it on DVD
Ooh.
and Blu-ray in 2014.
I don't know what possibly a Blu-ray version of the film could offer that would make it worth needing to buy on that level of tech. But okay.
Who's to say? Aren't you glad to know that you have the option?
I am glad. I'm so glad. No, it gave me the option on Amazon Prime of doing, HD or SD, and I was like, why would I pay more for an HD version of Leprechaun 3?
Do you want to know where I watched this movie on?
Yeah.
I watched Leprechaun 3 on Tubi, the free
Was it on
streaming service.
Tubi?
It was free. I watched it. I
Yes.
watched Leprechaun 3 for free on Tubi. I
Good
did
for
have to
you.
watch Leprechaun 3 with ads, so that was weird. That was a strange viewing experience. Tubi, if you're listening, maybe just like really front load these things, because it is definitely strange watching a movie like a YouTube video. But I
Yes.
was I was happy to not pay for it. I don't know if I
Good for
watched
you. Yeah.
SD or HD. Maybe I did get the HD version, but
Maybe
I
you
got
did. I
ads.
mean, I think I paid $4. So it was a $4 I was willing to spend, but honestly, not much more than that because I'm not sure. I want to go back to Davis's comment because was it really the funniest for him? So was it maybe the filming experience? Like, is he conflating the joy he had filming it with the film, or does he really think it's the funniest? Because obviously he can say what he wants. I'm sure that they weren't like, your job and future in Hollywood will be jeopardized if you don't praise Leprechaun 3. But I'm not sure it was. I think the second one was better, I guess is what I'm trying to get out. And I'm wondering what it was about the third one. Other than I know there was some fun stuff that happened in terms of production in that when they were on the strip, everyone was really excited because they were like, oh my gosh, am I going to get to be in a Leprechaun movie? And then I also read that when they were doing the scene where the Leprechaun is in the streets, that people kept pulling over to like try to give him a ride because who wouldn't want to give Warwick Davis a ride? But
Yeah,
that's so maybe there's something in there that was really enjoyable, but
perchance.
I don't think this is the funniest one by any stretch.
No, I would agree. I was and it's also not the sharpest made. I still lean to number two for both of those,
Hmm.
funniest and best executed. So
But I do think it makes sense to put us in Vegas. I think that
indeed,
if you think about the now, I'm not sure that it will make sense once we move past number 3. But if you think about the locations of where we're going, we are going increasingly to places that make sense for a leprechaun, right? So in the first one, we're kind of in generic suburbia / out in the middle of nowhere. In the second one, we're in LA, which is, a city kind of known for greed. But then it was like, no, wait, let's go to the city that's truly known for greed. So in that respect, I think that they've been making logical sense in terms of their geographic decisions. But number 4 is the one in space, right?
you are correct. Next, we travel to
So
space.
so I'm not entirely sure that the logic continues, or maybe it does. Maybe space is the greediest place that you can be.
It's the final frontier for colonization, question mark. I don't know. Maybe it does potentially seem like a stretch, but I guess you could say that for any of these films. And
Yes.
so far, and that hasn't stopped them. So I'll be interested. I am curious to, it is baffling to me that they go from space and then they're like, where next? The hood.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
That's gonna be an interesting that'll be an
It
interesting
is.
transition for the franchise.
It is, and it's really interesting to me that of the franchises and looping Halloween into the mix. So obviously Halloween needs to happen all in Haddonfield, more or less, because that's, the origin story. Obviously Friday the 13th is gonna largely happen in at Camp Crystal Lake, except for the 15 minutes we'll spend in New York. And then Nightmare, is keeping us in whatever. Now I can't remember the name of that town. But I think it's interesting that of the franchises, it is the Leprechaun franchise that moves us around the most geographically and is like, actually, what's most interesting is not Leprechaun. It's Leprechaun in Vegas, in space, in the hood. And that's an intriguing decision for a franchise to make. So I'll be excited to see where we go in space. I'll also be interested to know if there's any, because he burns at the end of 3, right?
He does. He gets
the gold
burned
burns
alive.
Yes.
And that's what allows Scott to transform back from Leprechaun mode. And they're even though they have the coin at the end and they could possibly make a wish,
they could have.
They decide not to.
And maybe it's the fact that they didn't burn all the gold. Maybe that's how he can come back, or maybe
potentially,
or maybe they're just gonna do
ignore
what they did with this
all of
one
the events of
and
the
just
previous
ignore
film.
all of the events of the previous one. Yeah.
Think of how easy it would be to write stories if you could just always do that.
I don't know. It bothers me so much with anything else, but I find it so delightful for Leprechaun that they're just like, don't even go there. Just see what happens.
Is Warwick Davis. Like, that's it.
Yes.
So they're just like, that's all we need. Just bring us your crazy ideas and we'll film it as long as it's cheap.
Yes. And Davis is in the space one? Is he?
He is.
Okay.
Yeah. When does he stop?
Because I don't think he's in the like most recent one, the one that came out like in the teens, 2013 or something like that.
Yeah, so we didn't reprise it in Leprechaun Returns after the birth of his child.
That makes sense. I read somewhere, and I don't know if they did it or not, that they even talked about, to further reduce the budget for this film, not even having Davis always be the Leprechaun in scenes when they could get away with it so that they could pay him less. And I just like, he's not making that much. Like, there's just so much about this that I find delightful.
He could be getting a majority of the $1.2 million budget, and he would be worth it,
the majority of it. Yeah. I mean, he is more or less the Leprechaun in the same way that Robert Englund is Freddy Krueger. I do want to say that what I thought was interesting about this film is that there were all of these things that I think could have been very funny, but that were played almost for non-comedic effect. So like Scott's obsession when he becomes a leprechaun with potatoes had the potential, I think, to be kind of funny gag, but it wasn't, right? It was kind of played straight because so much of the film is played weirdly straight. But there you go. That's Leprechaun 3. I don't have anything more to say about Leprechaun 3, Toni. Do you have anything else to say?
I have no other thoughts. Head empty.
For those of you that are longtime listeners, you know that about now is when I asked Toni, what is our next episode going to be on? And we recorded that segment, and then we realized that our next episode is our 100th episode, which is a huge big deal for us. We're really excited that we've been talking with each other for so long on this podcast and that you all have been listening for so long. So we've decided to pivot what we're going to do for our 100th episode. We're going to spend some time talking with each other about the journey that we've been on, what we have noticed has changed or remained the same in our interest in talking about horror with one another, maybe some of our highlights and episodes that we particularly liked. And we'll also use it as an opportunity to talk about Paul Tremblay's horror movie and novel, which came out in June 11, 2024, which just so happens to be my birthday. And it seems like a perfect opportunity for us to celebrate an author that we often return to on this podcast. So if you have an opportunity, we encourage you to read Paul Tremblay's horror movie and novel, and we look forward to hearing from you and talking with each other on our 100th episode.